Greetings. This is being recorded on September 13th. And unfortunately, we are back to doing videos, bi-monthly videos. The powers that be have decided it's not entirely safe to meet again in person. Hopefully by January, we can resume our monthly live get-togethers. The task for me today is sort of impossible. That is to say, to sort of talk about from 9/11 to Afghanistan and not bore you to tears because you've probably been listening to this stuff for days and weeks and you can hardly stand thinking about it anymore. I hope that those of you who've watched Frontline, who about a week ago, I think, did a 2-hour, very excellent program. I suggest you watch it if you can. It should be found on PBS online, I would imagine, and maybe on YouTube. It really does kind of trace the whole set of events. And you also probably are aware that everybody and their uncle are now screaming bloody murder about how, Biden screwed it all up. Otherwise, everything would have been fine. Anthony Blinken, as we record, is testifying and getting an earful about how, it's all Biden's fault. Now, I think the reason people are going back to 9/11 is not just because 9/11 started the whole trajectory in some ways that have gotten us to now, here and now, but it's pretty hard to understand not just the international politics and the Afghanistani politics, but also the US domestic politics, unless one really sees what has happened in the last 20 years. Because while people keep talking about the degree to which Afghanistan got transformed, it didn't get transformed by the 20 years of occupation. What is also the case is that the motivations for the whole enterprise and the unwinding of American international policy, that is to say, the invasion of Iraq, to put it mildly, has transformed not just the domestic politics in the United States, but has transformed the standing of the United States in the world. The US had a lot of sympathy for wanting to go after bin Laden, given what happened at 9/11. But the world and our allies started raising major questions when we invaded Iraq. And the world also started raising major questions when the fallout for the invasion of Iraq and our actual activities in Afghanistan, once we went in, seemed to be countervail, I would say, America's historic sense of itself and the world's sense of America's role in the world. After all, we were credited in many ways for our policies during and after World War II. It was the US who could get much of the credit for putting in place international treaties on human rights, on genocide, development of international law, the development of the United Nations, and so on. And so we got a lot of credit for that. And it has come as a shock, bit by bit, and certainly now 20 years later in the reevaluation, that many of the things we put in place to make it a safer, better, more legal and humane world are in fact things that the US violated, both in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and around the world. Without going into great detail, what has happened in Guantanamo and what's happened in Iraq and Al Ghraib was shocking to the world. The torture of people, the disregard for the values that we preached. And so we lost influence. We were still strong. After all, quote unquote, we won the Cold War. We have lots of weapons. We have a powerful military. But much of international relations is in fact based on influence, what is called soft power, the ability of others to follow and your policies, but also be in alliance with you and to see the world more or less the way you see it. And that has radically eroded even before you talk about the pullout in Afghanistan. In fact, the pull out of Afghanistan is sort of and the mess that engendered is sort of, in a sense, the last nail in the coffin, right? So the US, we still think of ourselves as a dominant power in the world. And sure, in terms of military might and economic might, we are. But in terms of the world admiring us, us having the capacity to influence other actors, our leverage, the admiration for us has almost completely eroded. And the most recent events in Afghanistan, even though the Republicans now blame it all on Biden, it is worth remembering that it was the Trump administration that negotiated in Doha with the Taliban. Did not include the then sitting government of Afghanistan, made deals with the Taliban to allow thousands, hundreds, thousands of people out of prison, including Taliban fighters, didn't put into place any reasonable way to manage the end of American involvement in Afghanistan, and just sort of handed to the Biden administration a date, which was originally in May, that we should just kind of get out. All right, so Biden didn't just get out in May, we got out in September. But the unraveling of how we got out is, of course, as you well know, on Biden, right? Getting out, I think we could all agree after 20 years was a perfectly reasonable thing to do. The mess of us getting out and the unpreparedness of both the State Department and the military to do this properly and do this humanely is really not, on the one hand, a carryover from the Trump administration, which I'll explain in a minute, but is also to be blamed on the Biden administration, who were either not aware of what was going to happen if we just sort of left, or if they were aware, had no way of managing it. Now, it should be said that before we got to the actual pullout and the hundreds and thousands of Afghanistanis who worked with the US military and non-governmental organization, before any of that came to light, it has been years that Afghanistanis who worked with the military, who had been promised that they can come to the United States, were waiting to get the proper credentials. There were folks waiting 4, 5, even 6 years as their papers didn't get processed. And why did their papers not get processed? Among other things, because the anti-immigration Trump administration got rid of almost everybody in the State Department who would normally process these things and would generate reasonable policies for allowing these people who had been promised they come to the US to come to the US. And the State Department in general was hauled out during the Trump administration. And so when the Biden administration took over, they were either unaware or didn't know how to rapidly proceed in restaffing the State Department, and particularly staffing huge numbers of people who could process the paperwork and the applications. So part of the mess was, well, people didn't have the proper credentials, they didn't have the proper papers. Well, to begin with, of course, for people who actually work with the US military, there was biometric information about them, and it would have been possible to set up ways to have people that they worked for in the military certify that they actually worked for them. So there was a way around insisting, well, we just don't have the paperwork and it's, we can't process it. The mess of the airport, at the airport, the unpreparedness on the part of both you're going to pass by here, please. Sorry, there's people passing here. The unwillingness of people to, prepare properly, either in Afghanistan or in the State Department, to pull in people from other government agencies, is a replication in a sense of the mess we have seen at the US border with Mexico, right? And the Biden administration should have known that something needed to be done. So it seems to me that the incredible mess, the fact that people got killed, that people got left behind, etc., that really is a question not just of having inherited a mess, but not being aware or not being willing or not being able to create a more orderly process. Now, why is this relevant? Of course, it's relevant to the people who suffered getting out. It's relevant for the people who didn't get out, but it's also relevant in terms of the image of the United States. I mean, any vestiges we had left of respect of how we were handling Iraq and Afghanistan and other places eroded, right? And furthermore, the Biden administration made it worse by its lack of consultation with many of our allies. After all, the Germans and the French and the Belgians and the Dutch, they all had small contingents in Afghanistan. And the lack of consultation and the lack of preparedness with respect to them was really historically will be seen as shocking. It got so bad, in fact, that when the Prime Minister of England called Biden to talk to him about aspects of this, it took 2 days for the Biden and the Biden administration to get back to the Prime Minister of England. Now, that's our closest ally. And typically, when the American president calls the English Prime Minister or vice versa, they get back within an hour or two, if not minutes. So it's shocking. This is our closest ally, but the Europeans were also shocked. And so, yes, we're getting out of Afghanistan. We left a mess behind. The fact that there was going to be a mess was written in the stars. After all, Russia, first the English and then the Russians, also didn't manage to sort out Afghanistan. So that part is more comprehensible. But the loss of influence that the US has suffered as a consequence of this is not really repairable very easy. If one reads the European and our allied newspapers or listens to the heads of state, they're essentially all saying, we can't count on the US anymore, we have to go it alone. We need to develop better mechanisms to do things on our own. Sure, the American umbrella is still there, but in terms of policy, the strong alliances that were built up over decades with allies in Europe, with allies in other parts of the world, that is essentially gone up in smoke. Poof, it's gone. And it will take a huge effort and it will take a long time, if ever, to repair that. So the US as a major power in the world, as a major influence in the world, is now residually residing in our economic might and in our military might, but we've essentially lost influence. And I'm suggesting it is very difficult to repair. If you want to understand how the rural Afghanistanis feel, some may be pro-Taliban, some maybe not. There was a very good article in the New Yorker, for those of you who have access, I think one edition back. The author was Gopal. It is called The Other Afghan Women, and it really tells a story how people suffered in rural Afghanistan, not just from the Taliban, but being killed and maimed right, left, and center by American military mistakes, by drones, by all kinds of attacks that went awry, that killed civilians. We read in the newspaper, or we have read in the newspaper, there was attack and X number of Taliban were killed somewhere let's say 5 years ago, and some few civilians were killed. Well, you listen to this woman tell the story of her family, and you can see that there were very many rural Afghanistanis who lost members of families, children, relatives, and so forth. Now, these people just want peace, right? And if the Taliban can provide some kind of peace, just anybody provide peace, stop invading us, foreigners go home. So it's not just that we quote unquote accomplished our goal of getting rid of bin Laden. It's the fact that that country has suffered for 20 more years under US auspices. Now, am I being unfair here? Yes, a little bit, because during the last 20 years, urban Afghanistan modernized, women got educated. Afghanistan, in many ways, is not the place it was 20 years ago. And the US policy there, especially the role of so many NGOs, so many charities from Western countries, have helped transform Afghanistan. And the people who will have already, but certainly will notice this, are amongst others the Taliban, because they are now dependent on educated Afghanistanis who they need to govern. They can't kill them all. They can't, lock them all up at home. And the country is on its knees in terms of food, in terms of medical care, and so forth. It needs outside help. And the outside help is still provided by NGOs and the United Nations. But if they get chased out, then the Taliban is, in a situation of total crisis and total chaos. So the Taliban's moderating its policies right now has a lot to do with the fact that they have a realistic sense, or at least a semi-realistic sense, that the degree to which their country has changed over 20 years, and in which case a chunk of their population, maybe even as much as 30% of the population in urban areas, are now connected to the world, much better educated, may even be somewhat secular in their religious beliefs. And all these people, as the Taliban has been saying, can't just be allowed to leave, right? They want to keep people there because they're going to need those people to govern. So what can now be done? What can the US do to help, in a sense, the people of Afghanistan, even though we have left, if not the Taliban itself? And of course, the Taliban has no economic resources because the money, the currency, the assets of Afghanistan are held outside, and they're frozen, outside Afghanistan, and they're frozen. So the question has now arisen, should these assets be unfrozen? And the answer is probably yes, though to whom and how should they be unfrozen? And perfectly intelligent discussions are going on right now to say, let's unfreeze them, but let's unfreeze some of them and only to funnel into the non-governmental organizations in the United Nations to provide food for the starving Afghanistanis and medical care. How this is exactly going to work, whether it's going to work, whether the Republicans will stand in the way of that working because they're so busy condemning the Biden administration and blaming everything on Afghanistan, on the Biden administration. Ironic, of course, because what happened in Afghanistan and our invasion in Iraq was under the Bush administration, right? So the Republicans bear a very heavy responsibility, Cheney, Rumsfeld, those folks, for what has been going on. and the consequence of US policy. Admittedly, other people went along and it seemed like a good idea. You know, the US has a tendency, or its citizens have a tendency not to pay a whole lot of attention to foreign affairs. We're pretty ill-informed. Most countries, most people in the United States couldn't find Qatar and Doha on a map. Doha was where the negotiations of the Trump administration and the Taliban took place, and Doha is where many people were flown to who were refugees. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. You know, we only pay attention when some demagogue, for example, Trump, and now some Republican congressmen and senators, make a big deal out of it. But we're not really well informed as a citizenry, and we're mostly interested in our own domestic affairs. Now, there is a link nowadays between 9/11 and January 6th, right? Because as many intelligent people are pointing out, that the terrorism that we were fighting in the world, and we're continuing to fight around the world, is of course now in the United States, right? Extremists not only did what they did in January 6th, trying to overthrow the government, but they're right out there now as we speak. Elections are said to be invalid if you don't win. You might have noticed that the Republican candidate for replacing Governor Newsom, before the elections ever taken place, has already said that if he loses, it'll be an invalid election. We have extremists on the radio, we have demagogues and extremists on the media, including on Fox News, who are fanning the flames. So our domestic politics is now informed by the paranoia and the spillover or spill back, if you will, from all the messes of what we created overseas because of Iraq, Afghanistan, etc. So rather than our pullout of Afghanistan being just an international issue that will soon go away and we'll forget about, we won't be able to forget about it even if we can manage not to pay much attention in the future to Afghanistan, because in point of fact, it has fundamentally changed the country we all now live in. The idea, of course, is that the US should get out of the business of fighting terrorism abroad and should get in the business of worrying about terrorism at home. I would suggest we actually are still engaged in both of them. Most people, I think, don't realize that the US is in 80 different countries with something on the order of 750 million American special forces and soldiers. We're all over the creation, in the Sahel in Africa, in the Horn of Africa, in the Middle East, and everywhere we're quote unquote fighting terrorism. That's a subject in and of itself, but we shouldn't imagine just because quote unquote we've left Afghanistan, we're out of fighting terrorism every which way. And the problem is not that terrorism should not be put down, but the more fundamental questions have to be asked at what creates terrorism. And terrorism on the whole is created when people find themselves on the short end of the stick. They're not getting more affluent, they're getting richer. They're not getting richer, other people are getting richer. The societies are unfair, they're unequal. People are alienated, they want to leave their own countries, had the big immigration from Africa and elsewhere, Latin America, to industrial countries. People feel hopeless, and the hopelessness and the inability to imagine a future leads people A, to want to leave their own country, and B, often to join terrorist organizations in the belief that if they could overthrow the current corrupt governments and take over, then the situation would be better. Of course, we know that when the terrorists take over in various places, they also tend to become corrupt, but that's a separate issue. So having moved out of Afghanistan essentially has not moved us out of being everywhere in the rest of the world. And there is one underlying theme to all of this. And the underlying theme is that we go into countries whose cultures we don't understand. We imagine we understand them. We imagine that if we hire a translator to help the military understand local conditions, that we actually know what we're doing. And while much of the US military is very admirable and knows what it's doing, our involvement in other countries, in the domestic affairs of other countries, in complicated societies, has been a disaster and will continue to be a disaster unless we learn lessons. You have heard probably that a fair number of critiques of us having pulled out of Afghanistan is the fact that we should have stayed. Well, no, we shouldn't have stayed in Afghanistan. It's just our departure from Afghanistan was badly mishandled, it seems to me. So where are we in all of this? We are a country that used to be powerful. We still are powerful. We are military powerful. We are still a powerful economy. We have many admirable characteristics as a country, but we are also a transformed country. And our transformation needs to be addressed at home rather than whitewashed in some quarters and assume that if we get busy and pay attention to the rest of the world, the US political life, social life will become less bifurcated, and we will be seen as less hypocritical as we are seen today. Now, I am not saying we should go back to isolation. The world can't go back to isolation. We are interlinked through trade, through communications, and so forth. What I am saying is that unless we take seriously that much of our work has to be domestic, and the change in domestic politics, and a recognition of our political life at this point being totally bifurcated and paranoid, unless we clean up our own messes, we will not be viewed, or we cannot reintroduce ourselves into the world as a more reliable, more admirable, more influential country. We have lost influence with all well-informed people and governments in the world. And so our task as citizens, it seems to me, as well as the governments that represent us, is to acknowledge our failures and get quite busy educating ourselves to the new world we're living in. And the new world we're living in means that we, the US, are playing a very different role. It is one thing to say we've burned our fingers in the Middle East and in other parts of the world. Now we're going to concentrate on China. Yes, of course we have to concentrate on China. China and the US will be the dominant countries in the world for the foreseeable future and in most of our lifetime. But we need also to address our relations with our allies, try to recoup some influence, get busy being reasonable in terms of helping Afghanistanis, even if they're the Taliban, get back on their feet, stop condemning Islam as a religion, see it as a religion like every other religion. The extremes of Islam, Shia Islam, and so forth, which all have reason to be alarmed about and disproved are not necessarily what most mainstream people in those countries believe in. And whether it's Iran or Iraq or any other country in the Middle East, we need to find ways to deal and to have accommodations. And most importantly, let me emphasize the human element. Our treatment of immigrants, our treatment of refugees, the appalling lack of preparation for the Afghanistan refugees, be they Americans, Europeans, others, the unpreparedness, the way we deal with people along the border, the unwillingness to recognize that we're a country of immigrants and to stop being paranoid about people coming in. That will go a long way to make us look like a more reasonable country, like the country that our ideology and aspirations say we are, when in fact we have been violating it for a long time, most specifically under the Trump administration. But things have not gotten a whole lot better, I dare say, so far in the Biden administration, neither along the border, nor in terms of refugees, nor in terms of allowing people to resettle. Now, let me add a positive note. It's easy to say these are the worst of times in American history. That's probably not true. We've gone through other worse periods. The real question for us is to put shoulder to the wheel and see whether we can't do things better, we can reform ourselves internally and have better international policies, better interactions in this interdependent world, because we now live in a very interdependent world. And finally, let me say that in spite of the horrendous domestic politics in this country and the very bad foreign policies and all the mistakes of the last 20 years, what gets one to be more optimistic is that this country is full still of very, very good people who try to do their best and try to do the right thing. And one of the visible pieces of evidence of that is the treatment that the refugees are receiving in many of the states and the cities and the places in which they are arriving. Churches, temples, charities, NGOs, lots of people are putting shoulder to the wheel to help the refugees resettle. And that really is an image that we have enjoyed in the past, a welcoming, if not by governments, if not by certain politicians, but amongst us as citizens. And so the way it seems to me to put our shoulder to the wheel is to do whatever we can to help those organizations and those individuals that need our help because they're new arrivals in the same way that our ancestors and relatives were new arrivals, and to show that most of us are not crazies. Most of us can see the mistakes that have been made, and most of us are very willing and very able to be the kind of Americans that the world used to think of us as being collectively, but that we are still, as individuals and subgroups, the kind of Americans to be admired and to do well by those people who need our help. Okay, don't despair. Things often get better after they hit a low point. We may be at a low point. And I think perhaps, depending on what else goes on in my next talk, I will address China and new developments with respect to China. Thank you very much and be well.